In 1992, Elena Ward left a Memphis bar after her late shift and vanished in an alley less than 60 feet long. No scream, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw anything except her silhouette disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of any camera. The next morning, her Toyota was found in a strange parking lot, parked neatly, as if its owner had simply walked away normally. Police found no blood, no signs of forced entry, and after weeks of searching, the city began to whisper that Elena had walked away on her own to escape a tiring life. But 3 decades later, when an unidentified skeleton in Shelby Forest was DNA tested, and one small piece of evidence inside the car suddenly spoke, all those assumptions collapsed completely, because someone else had been with Elena the night she disappeared, and that someone knew exactly how to let the darkness hide them for 30 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Memphis on an early September evening still wore the leftover heat of a long day, heat that lingered between the old red brick buildings as if refusing to leave, while far off, wind from the Mississippi River carried a damp chill mixed with the smell of water and metal, creating a feeling that was half stifling, half vaguely unreal. The neon signs on Beale Street flickered unevenly, spilling purple-blue light onto the wet pavement left by a short afternoon rain, turning the whole street into a dazzling yet gloomy reflection. From the back door of the bar where she worked, Elena Ward stepped out, pulling her shoulder bag a little closer, saying goodnight to the 2 co-workers still cleaning in the kitchen. They watched her disappear behind the heavy door, never imagining that was the last time they'd see Elena leave the bar so calmly. The alley behind the bar was darker than usual. The dangling bulb on the wall had been flickering for weeks, casting patchy pools of light that brightened and dimmed. There was only the low hum of air conditioners from neighboring buildings, the distant sound of traffic from the boulevard, and faint blues music blending together like the city's long tired sigh. Elena walked into that alley, with a quick but unhurried stride, the way someone does who's completely used to walking home alone late at night. A man living in a second-floor apartment glanced down from his half-open window. He saw Elena pass beneath the flickering light, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold breeze, but looking completely normal. No one following her, no argument, no sign she was afraid. But as Elena continued toward the end of the alley, where the glow from Beale Street no longer reached, the darkness began swallowing her footsteps, and there, right on the border between light and shadow, it seemed someone was standing. No clear shape, no visible face, just a motionless black mass, as if it had been waiting there for a long time. That presence made no sound, yet it felt like a heavy object had just dropped onto the pavement, instantly changing the air around Elena. She paused for a brief beat, as if trying to decide whether she'd seen something or not, then glanced quickly over her shoulder to check if anyone else was in the alley. Only the wind, only the music from the bar whose door had just closed. Elena took a breath, tightened her bag strap and kept walking. Her silhouette melted into the darkness at the end of the alley, an area the 1992 street cameras couldn't capture at all. No one knows what happened after that moment. All we know is that from the second Elena vanished from the last witness site, Memphis was never quite the same Memphis again. That night passed without anyone noticing the unusual silence from Elena's apartment. Her landline rang a few times and stopped. The next morning she didn't show up for her shift, didn't text the manager, didn't answer any calls. Hours of waiting turned into a heavy pressure the family could no longer ignore. When every reasonable explanation evaporated and fear overtook hope, they finally picked up the phone and called the police, starting what would become Memphis's most mysterious missing person case for the next 3 decades. When the missing person call reached the MPD dispatcher, Memphis was still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness, a thin river fog crawling into the city like a cold cloth draped over every roof. The 2 officers sent to check the area where Elena was last seen started in the alley behind the bar, where she'd stepped into the dark. Their flashlight beams sliced across the damp pavement, illuminating peeling brick and scattered puddles, but there was nothing, except overlapping shoe prints, no struggle marks, no dropped items, no obvious starting point. They walked slowly along the wall where Elena had paused, hoping for a scratch, a scrap of fabric, anything unusual, but everything was inexplicably clean, as if the alley had been wiped of evidence. The officers widened the search to the small parking lots scattered around Beale Street. Those lots were lit by a few flickering sodium lamps that made the concrete seem to ripple. A man from the apartments across the street came out in a windbreaker, holding a cold cup of coffee. He said last night he'd heard a startled sound, like someone stumbling or being yanked backward, short and sharp, but gone so fast, he figured it was just trash cans or stray cats. No one in the neighborhood saw anything specific. One person mentioned running footsteps, another a metallic clatter, but nobody could say for sure if it was connected. Police wrote everything down, though none of it was solid enough to form a picture. Inside the bar, where Elena worked, everything looked exactly as it had the night before. Tables uncleared, glasses upside down on the shelf, even the apron she hung in the break room still in place. A coworker pointed to Elena's locker. Her wallet and ID were still inside, as if she'd only stepped out for a minute. If Elena had left voluntarily, she would have come back for those essentials. She never did. That realization made the air in the room thick, as if everyone suddenly sensed a truth no one wanted to say aloud. As the sun climbed higher, police extended the search toward the main boulevard. They checked intersecting alleys, shadowed corners between warehouses, and shuttered stores. A few morning joggers were stopped and asked if they'd noticed anything odd. Most just shook their heads, confused. Even the garbage collectors, shop owners opening up, and delivery drivers had nothing useful. One young officer suggested checking the big dumpsters behind the night market, because missing people sometimes leave something when they're forced to move. But everything was clean, no scrap of paper, jewelry, or personal item that could lead to Elena. That level of cleanliness wasn't normal for Memphis, especially behind Beale Street, where every morning brought piles of trash, bottles and food wrappers. The too clean feeling didn't produce evidence, but it planted a quiet unease in every observer. A veteran sergeant, after circling the bar once more, muttered to his partner, "If someone wanted to grab a person and leave nothing behind, this is the perfect spot." The comment never made it into an official report, but it echoed the first thought many on the team had. The disappearance was too smooth, too tidy, as if the perpetrator knew exactly how to manipulate the scene to avoid detection. As sunlight began slanting across the old walls, the search moved into its fourth hour. Police had covered the area behind the bar at least 3 times, checking every back door, every corner, every storm drain. They canvassed the residential buildings behind it, and got one more vague statement. A woman said she'd seen a dark-colored van parked oddly near the alley last night, but it was too dim to see clearly. No plate, no exact time, nothing except a hazy gut feeling. Everything was noted, but nothing carried enough weight to open a real investigative direction. When an officer returned to the bar for more information, the manager just shook his head, eyes dark. Elena never missed a shift, not once in all these years. That simple sentence, yet heavy as lead, changed the atmosphere. This was no longer someone running late or with a dead phone. This was something else, something bad. Time passed, the searches yielded nothing, and Elena's disappearance took on a different face, too clean, too fast, too precise. As if she'd stepped into a patch of darkness the entire city couldn't see through. And at the end of this part, only one cold fact remained. Although police had combed every square foot around where Elena was last seen, there wasn't a single verifiable trace. Elena had dissolved into the Memphis night air, a void so perfect it made every investigator shiver. At noon on the second day after Elena vanished, as the Memphis heat started rising again, as if the pavement itself were exhaling, the search got a call from a parking lot security guard east of downtown. He reported a vehicle, matching the police description, a late 1980s silver Toyota, parked in a lot Elena had no reason to ever visit. The radio message sent the entire search team redirecting almost instantly. The location was far from Elena's usual route, more than 1.5 miles from where she was last seen, and in the opposite direction from the way she normally went home. That made officers doubt it could really be her car, but when they arrived, all doubt vanished. The Toyota sat at the far end of the lot, in an almost empty row, beneath the canopy of an old oak. Midday sun striped through the branches, making the car look even more out of place in the deserted area. Doors closed neatly shut, no pry marks, no broken glass, no scratches on the handles. The car was unusually clean, at least for someone who drove regularly and worked night shifts where road dust and grit stuck to everything. The interior was the same, no disturbance, no purse, no jacket, no personal items. The keys were not in the car. That immediately created a huge gap in logic. If Elena drove herself here, where did she go? If she didn't drive, why would an abductor bring the car all the way here and leave it looking like the owner had parked it normally? But the biggest question was, why abandon the car in a place that had zero connection to any part of Elena's life? A young officer walked around the car, crouched to look at the right front tire, then the left. His gaze lingered longer than usual, but there was nothing specific to note. He only said quietly, "Doesn't look like the spot someone parks when they're in a hurry." The whole scene felt like a carefully staged still photograph. That stillness made the investigators fall silent, a few seconds longer than normal, as if everyone sensed something wrong, but couldn't yet name it. Partly because the car gave nothing useful on first inspection. No visible blood, no footprints around it, except the usual jumble from passers-by. No drag marks, no signs of struggle. Police opened the doors with specialized tools to preserve any latent evidence. They noted every detail, driver's seat adjusted quite close to the steering wheel, closer than family said Elena normally. Sat glove box closed tight, floor mats very clean, radio off, but clock still running. One small but stranger detail, the passenger window was cracked open about 2 fingers width. Not enough for a hand, but also not something Elena usually did. It was written down, but meant nothing yet. The lot attendant was asked if he saw who parked the car. He shook his head, said the lot was quiet yesterday, and the car could have been there since the previous evening, without anyone noticing. When pressed for exact timing, he was even less sure, maybe from dusk, maybe early morning. "I don't watch every single car." That left the timeline surrounding the car completely vague. No one knew precisely when it appeared. The lot's location made the case even more confusing. It wasn't on Elena's route home, not near her workplace, not near any gas station or store she frequented. It wasn't even close to friends or family. With all available information, there was no reason for Elena to drive herself here, and absolutely no reason for her to park neatly and then disappear without a word. An investigator sergeant, who had worked missing persons cases for 20 years, stared at the car a long time before saying a short sentence that made the other officers pause. If she didn't drive it here, somebody else did. That opened the possibility the car had been moved, but by whom and when was unknown. And if someone did drive it here, they did it extremely carefully. No forced entry, nothing spilled inside, no obvious trace. That carefulness wasn't accidental. It turned the car into a paradox, sitting right there yet revealing nothing, as if someone deliberately placed it to create the impression Elena had left Beale Street on her own and gone somewhere by herself. But nothing around it matched. Elena's last known footsteps were in the alley behind the bar. The disappearance route didn't line up with the route to this lot. If the car was moved after Elena vanished, the person responsible knew the area well enough to choose a parking spot that wouldn't draw attention. When police finished processing the scene, no one said it out loud, but everyone felt a chill crawl from the metal into their arms. That wasn't just cold steel, it came from realizing the car, the first piece of evidence any missing person case hopes for, had instead become proof this case was being controlled by another hand from the very beginning. Elena wasn't there. There was no trail to follow, only the car sitting perfectly still, like a question no one could answer. And from that moment on, the case was no longer just a missing person. It started taking the shape of something else. Darker, more mysterious, and definitely not random. After Elena's Toyota was found in a strange parking lot, the next almost obligatory step for any investigator was to return to the starting point and ask what seemed like a simple question: if everything had gone normally that night, which route would Elena have taken, how long would it take, and why did her car end up in a place that wasn't on any logical path of hers? They started at the Beale Street bar, where Elena finished her shift. Standing at the exact back door she'd walked out of, the lead investigator looked down the alley, trying to picture the footsteps of a woman leaving work, tired, but alert, carrying the routine of hundreds of previous nights. The most familiar route was mapped out from the back door, up the alley, left onto the side street that connected to the nearby lot, where she usually parked, then the shortest drive home, crossing a few streets, and merging onto a stretch of boulevard. Everyone who knew her confirmed Elena was steady, rarely changed habits. She wasn't the type to take the scenic route, just to sightsee late at night. Yet her car was in a completely different lot, more than a mile and a half away, veering northeast, where she had no friends, no family, no reason to stop. The investigator pinned the routes on a wall map in the briefing room, a red line from the bar to the usual lot, and a blue line from the bar to the lot, where the car was found. The two lines practically split downtown in half, with no intersection. If Elena took the blue route, she did it on purpose. If she didn't drive it, someone else took the car along the blue route to hide it somewhere outside her logic. There were no street cameras in 1992 to verify the exact journey. The few that existed were mostly in front of banks or big stores, recording low-quality VHS only during business hours. The alley behind the bar wasn't covered by any system. Investigators tried tracking down any private security cameras at shops along the theoretical routes, but that year most small businesses still relied on iron locks and trust, not surveillance systems. All they had left were statements from nearby residents, but human memory doesn't work like a camera. One person swore they saw Elena turn right out of the alley, while another insisted she went straight toward the main street. Both spoke with absolute certainty, yet only one or neither could be right. Investigators tried using time as a tool. From the bar to the usual lot on foot took roughly 5 to 7 minutes at an average walking pace. From the bar to the lot where the car was found, walking would take at least 20 minutes, crossing several intersections and a poorly lit stretch. No one in the surrounding neighborhood reported seeing Elena walking that longer route that night. If she had walked it, someone would likely remember, because it wasn't a completely deserted area. That led to one quiet conclusion: between the moment she left the bar's back door and the moment the car appeared in the distant lot, there was a gap ordinary logic couldn't fill. She almost certainly did not drive the car there herself. The next question: did Elena even reach her car? No witness said they saw her get in it. No camera, no lot attendant to confirm. From an investigative standpoint, there were at least two scenarios. One, she was stopped in the alley, never made it to the car, and the perpetrator later located the car, took the keys, and moved it. 2, she reached the car, got in with someone, or was forced to drive, was then overpowered somewhere along the way, and the offender later returned and drove the car to the distant lot. Both scenarios led to the same realization: the car's presence there was not the product of chance, but a calculated act. Yet what that calculation was meant to hide remained a blank. They drew possible routes a vehicle could have taken from the usual lot to the discovered lot, marking them with small arrows. None were logical shortcuts, all wound through residential areas or quiet streets. An older investigator suddenly pointed to a nearby dead-end branch and said, "If I wanted to move a car without being seen, I'd pick streets like these." But it was still just speculation. No tire tracks, no cameras, no direct witnesses. The very absence of everything: data, footage, exact times, made reconstructing Elena's route feel like trying to complete a puzzle someone had deliberately thrown away the most important pieces of. They knew she left the bar. They knew she never made it home. They knew her car sat neatly in a distant lot, but the path connecting those 3 points was only an imaginary line on a map, with no evidence to back it up. When the first internal report on route reconstruction was finished, anyone reading it couldn't miss the repeated phrases: unknown, not confirmed, no corroborating witness. Those weren't just empty boxes on a form, they were blind spots any smart perpetrator would want to create. And right in the middle of those blind spots, Elena had disappeared. The case, once a disappearance that might still be explained by everyday reasons, began sliding into fog where every logical step led only to an invisible wall. The investigation moved into day 3 with a significant shift in approach. Police realized they couldn't follow physical traces because none existed, so they returned to the oldest and sometimes more effective method than science: people. They began interviewing everyone who had been near the bar the night Elena vanished. The initial list had 14 names, but within hours it grew to more than 20, including bar staff, patrons, residents around the alley, and a few late-night passers-by. But instead of producing a clearer picture, police received a jumble of mismatched, distorted, and even unbelievably contradictory fragments. Some statements aligned on the confirmed timeline. Elena said goodbye to coworkers, walked out the back door, stepped into the alley. But immediately after that rare point of agreement, the stories split into 3 completely different directions, 3 versions of the same moment, where if one person was right, the other 2 had to be wrong. The problem was no version was strong enough to rule out the others. Witness 1, a middle-aged woman in the second-floor apartment, stuck to what she'd said in her initial statement. She saw Elena walking alone, shoulder bag, normal posture, and nothing happened right then. She said Elena never looked back, never changed direction, and no one approached her. To her, it was simply the familiar sight of someone leaving work late. Witness 2, a young man passing the alley on his way home, gave a different account. He said he saw a male figure standing at the end of the alley, face unclear, but definitely male, because of broad shoulders and stiff stance. He remembered Elena seeming to slow down as she passed that spot, as if cautious. He even recalled a scuffing sound like shoes scraping brick when the 2 got close. When asked if he was sure it was Elena, he replied, "It was dim, but I think it was her. Build and hair matched." That statement forced investigators to take it seriously, but it couldn't stand alone, because Witness 1 completely denied anyone else was in the alley. Witness 3 offered yet another story. He was a customer who left the bar a few minutes after Elena. He claimed he saw her standing near the payphone on the corner, not heading straight to the usual lot. She was slightly hunched, maybe looking for coins or waiting for something. He was even certain he saw a dark blue pickup truck driving slowly through the area at that exact moment. He described the truck confidently, older model, dark blue silver decal on the side of the bed. But when police asked for a plate, he just shook his head. Too dark. The dark blue pickup. No one had mentioned it before. Police noted it but couldn't gauge reliability, because this statement placed Elena in a completely different location from the other 2 accounts. 3 statements, 3 different movements: walking straight through the alley, alone Ned; encountering a strange man at the end of the alley; standing by the payphone with a dark blue pickup appearing. If one was true, the other 2 had to be false, yet there was no evidence to disprove any of them. Each contained elements that could be accurate, and parts easily distorted by time or circumstance. This is the classic problem of crimes that happen in darkness. Witnesses see little, hear little, but feel a lot, and feelings don't always lead to truth. Police returned to the alley and surrounding area at the same time of night to test sightlines from each witness's position. They discovered that from the second-floor apartment you could clearly see the beginning of the alley, but not deep into the dark end, where the light was blocked. Meaning Witness 1 could be correct about what she could see, but wrong about what happened outside her view. Similarly, Witness 2 might have seen a real figure, but couldn't be certain it was Elena if the light was poor and the glimpse brief. One other woman passing at the same time, or Elena slowing for any other reason, and memory could merge the images. And the dark blue pickup statement. Investigators couldn't ignore it. Dark pickups were extremely common in Memphis back then, especially among freelancers, construction workers, night shift employees. But the silver decal on the bed was a more specific detail worth considering. That was the first time a mystery vehicle entered the case file. Still, police couldn't chase hundreds of dark blue pickups on that statement alone. No plate, no model year, no driver description, just a dark blue color, one that can shift under streetlights or in an observer's memory. In the briefing room, the lead investigator pinned 3 small diagrams on the board, each representing one statement, 3 arrows pointing in 3 different directions. They can't all be right, he said. But they also can't all be wrong. The room went quiet. Any of the statements could contain a sliver of truth, but no one knew which sliver. The circle of suspicion began to widen. Every man present near the alley, when Elena left, became a person of interest. Anyone who owned or had ever owned a dark blue pickup was added to a list. Anyone living nearby, matching the time frame, with any history of disturbance or suspicious behavior in the area, everything was logged. The number of potential suspects grew too large to process quickly, but what made the case even more elusive was the lack of convergence. No common denominator among the 3 statements, no repeated detail, no overlap for investigators to latch onto. It was as if Elena had stepped into a patch of darkness where reality itself bent, each witness catching a different slice of the same moment, producing 3 mismatched images that could all be true. And that was when the city of Memphis started feeling this disappearance was unnatural. It wasn't just a woman vanishing, it was the darkness she walked into swallowing the truth itself. The mystery vehicle that had just entered the file, a small but haunting detail, would not be the last time it was mentioned. But at that moment, with all the contradictory clues in front of them, investigators could only admit one thing. The circle of suspicion was growing larger, while Elena was slipping further and further from everyone's reach. When the circle of suspicion kept expanding without a focal point, Memphis police were forced to face an unwelcome reality. If Elena was no longer downtown, if her car had been deliberately moved, then the likelihood that she was taken out of the Beale Street area almost immediately after disappearing was very high. That meant the search area had to extend beyond familiar streets, beyond crowded neighborhoods, and reach places the city lights no longer touched, vast, dark, sparsely populated zones. One of the first locations added to the list was Meeman Shelby Forest, a 13,000+ acre wilderness north of Memphis, where the trees were so dense that morning sunlight struggled to break through and early fog often hung in thick white layers like smoke. It was a place people went for picnics, camping, fishing, but also an ideal spot for anyone who wanted to disappear, or to make something disappear. Linking a missing woman to such a huge forest might sound extreme, but investigators had no other choice. The abandoned car had shattered all initial logic, and if that was a sign Elena had been forcibly moved, they had to consider every possibility. A search team was formed with 2 groups, one of police, one of volunteers and park rangers. They brought probing sticks, evidence bags, forest maps, and radios. Though no one said it out loud, everyone knew a forest search wasn't about finding someone alive. The first area swept was the trail running south from the Poplar Tree Lake parking lot. The ground there was soft, grass tall, and the sound of insects mixed with rustling leaves swallowed every footstep. A veteran ranger led the way, explaining as he walked that campers often left trash or belongings behind, so anything that looked out of place would stand out immediately. But within the first few hours, the team realized one thing clearly: this forest was far too large to search for something specific without a clear direction. If Elena had ever been brought here, they would need luck to find any trace at all. And then luck, or something like it, appeared in the form of several small fabric scraps caught on bushes about 40 yards off the trail. A volunteer spotted them first. 3 pieces no bigger than half a palm, dark-colored, caked with dirt and sun-faded. The weave looked like cotton polyester blend, not thick like a jacket, but not thin either. Investigators carefully picked each piece up with tweezers and placed them in separate nylon bags. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone thought these could be parts of clothing or a bag. Yet Shelby Forest saw hundreds of hikers every week, many tearing clothing on branches without noticing. The scraps could belong to anyone, so even though their discovery made the air heavier, investigators stayed cautious. They marked the location, photographed the scene, and continued deeper into the woods. The afternoon wore on. Sunlight filtering through the canopy created strange light and shadow streaks on the ground. The team moved in a line, sweeping every square meter of weeds, but beyond a few old soda cans, a forgotten plastic sandal, and snack wrapper foil, nothing more valuable turned up. Those scattered items formed no pattern. They pointed to no stopping point, no direction for Elena. What puzzled police wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No drag marks, no dropped shoes, no jewelry, no dried blood on the dirt or rocks. If Elena had ever been in Shelby Forest, time and nature had erased her traces. But if she had never been here, why did those fabric scraps appear exactly when the search team expanded into this section? As light began to fade, the teams regrouped for debrief. The scraps were logged as temporary evidence. No one dared link them to Elena yet, but no one dismissed the possibility either. One officer quietly told his partner that finding the fabric felt like hearing an echo from somewhere, maybe a real clue, maybe just the echo of hope. The lead investigator noted everything in the report: fabric location, condition, wind direction, ground state. He knew this report was unlikely to produce an immediate breakthrough, but he also knew that in mysterious missing person cases, sometimes the tiniest detail, a thread, an odd patch of dirt, an overlooked angle, can later become the key that unlocks everything. The day ended heavy. They had gone far from Beale Street, covered a huge area, yet Elena was still nowhere in sight, and Shelby Forest, once a place people visited for peace, had become an extension of the darkness that swallowed Elena behind the bar. The fabric scraps in their nylon bags were all they had. Not enough to open a new line of inquiry, not enough to rule out coincidence, not enough to answer any question, but they remained in the file, a reminder that something in the forest had moved, however slightly. And sometimes those slightest movements lead to earthquakes later. The first months of 1993 passed in the strange silence of a case that cooled before it ever got hot, for lack of anything solid to pursue. The expanded Shelby Forest searches yielded no breakthrough. The collected fabric contained no identifying information, no usable DNA, and no investigator dared claim it belonged to Elena. Those scattered pieces, instead of connecting into a direction, only made the case resemble a jigsaw puzzle someone had thrown into the air and let fall, missing its most crucial tiles. Inside the investigative team's office, the files grew thinner. Update notes dwindled. New reports became rare, not because police stopped pursuing the case, but because there was so little left to pursue. Lead investigator Patterson stared at the wall map pinned with dozens of notes every day, and he grew accustomed to the feeling of helplessness, a feeling he never voiced, but everyone saw in the room, recognized in his eyes. By mid-1993, media pressure dropped noticeably. At first, Elena's disappearance made the front page of local papers and was mentioned nightly on the evening news. But without fresh developments, public interest shifted to other stories: car wrecks, gun violence, natural disasters, stories with pictures, numbers, daily changes. Elena's case offered only emptiness: a dark alley, an abandoned car, a woman gone without a trace. People didn't know what to expect, and when they don't know, they stop paying attention. For police, that was more troubling than media scrutiny. When the public stops asking, when the city stops looking their way, a case easily slides into cold storage, like hundreds of other unsolved disappearances. During this period, the original suspect list was re-examined. Many were cleared. A young male co-worker, some witnesses said, had been overly friendly with Elena, proved he was at a family religious service that night. A homeless man often seen around the alley was confirmed unrelated after a security guard remembered chasing him away hours before Elena's shift ended. A utility worker repairing streetlights who passed through the Beale area at the right time had a verified route and supervisor confirmation. Names were crossed off one by one, each clearance another bucket of cold water on the faint hope of a new lid. But one name remained, neither bolder nor faded: Raymond Cole, pastor of a small church about a 10-minute drive from Beale Street. A man with no criminal record, described by the community as calm, trustworthy, always helping others. Cole appeared in the file for two very vague reasons. One hazy witness thought they saw someone resembling him near the disappearance area, and a second-hand comment from Elena's friend that she had once attended an event at Cole's church months earlier. No clearer connection, no major conflict, no visible motive, yet Raymond Cole's name kept resurfacing in internal meetings, like an irritating note that played every time the list was reviewed. No one had enough to call him a suspect, but no one dared remove him either. What made Cole an uncomfortable shadow in the file wasn't that he seemed suspicious, it was that he didn't seem suspicious at all. Suspicious, innocent people are sometimes predictable, but people who leave no trace, show no overreaction, offer no overly detailed explanation, those are far harder to read. Cole's alibi for the night, Elena vanished, was recorded as solid. He said he stayed at the church until around 9 p.m., then drove home, read scripture, and went to bed. No one could prove it false, but no one could prove it true either. No cameras at the church, no one saw him leave or arrive home. No one heard his truck start. It all rested on one man's word, and in investigations, one person's word is always the least reliable evidence. The team visited the church 3 times in 1993, first to speak with Cole, next to check the surrounding area, the third time trying to find any record of that night's service, but the small church didn't keep attendance the way larger parishes did. Cole was cooperative, calm, never evasive, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Not worry, not defensiveness, but an almost excessive composure. For someone being questioned about a missing woman, that composure unsettled the investigators more than nervousness would have. In 1994, another disappearance occurred in Memphis, pulling police resources elsewhere. Elena's file gradually slid beneath stacks of newer cases. Meetings about her case grew rare. Sometimes only 2 detectives opened the folder on weekends to jot ideas they themselves barely believed in. Re-interviews of witnesses produced the same old information. No one remembered anything new. No one had seen anything else. A painful truth emerged. Human memory fades faster than paper records. What witnesses said in the first week was all police would ever have. After that, everything was speculation, doubt, or stories, the mind unconsciously stitched together. In 1995, the team compiled a comprehensive review to determine whether the case still had any chance of progress. The report ran over 70 pages, covering every detail from the day Elena vanished to that moment. One section was devoted to potential suspects. Under Raymond Cole's name, the investigator wrote exactly 3 lines. No incriminating evidence, alibi unverifiable, insufficient grounds to remove from list. Those 3 lines sat like indelible ink in the file. Not an accusation, but not an exoneration either. For 3 years the case neither advanced nor died completely. It was like a door left ajar. Everyone knew there might be nothing behind it, but there might also be something terribly dangerous. Cole stood inside that door, neither stepping out nor disappearing. In Investigator Patterson's office, the case map stayed on the wall the entire time. The lines marking possible routes Elena might have taken, witness locations, the parking lot where the car was found, everything remained untouched. But what Patterson remembered most wasn't the map. It was the name Raymond Cole, underlined once then erased, then circled faintly again. As years passed, that circle never faded, it only grew dusty with time, yet always stared back at them like a challenging eye. Impossible to prove he was involved. Impossible to prove he was innocent. Cole became the symbol of the kind of suspect every investigator dreads. One who leaves no trace, makes no mistake, takes no step back, takes no step forward. A man standing perfectly still while his shadow still covered the entire Elena Ward case. When the 4th year after Elena's disappearance began, hope of finding a new lead had become almost a luxury concept. The file had been reviewed countless times, old witnesses were tapped out, and the original evidence lacked the power to open any new direction. Yet right when everything seemed to sink into silence, a tiny discovery, tiny enough to be nearly overlooked at first, emerged from the most unexpected source. An independent search group of 3 local residents, who had followed Elena's case from the beginning, and refused to let it be forgotten, decided to spend a weekend combing an old industrial area south of the city. In the early 1990s, the site had housed active warehouses, but later became mostly abandoned, as companies moved elsewhere. Rough internal roads, weed-covered vacant lots littered with trash. This wasn't a place police thought Elena or her traces would appear, but for these civilians, Any unchecked spot could hold the answer. That morning, the sky was overcast, heavy clouds blocking most sunlight. The three split up, slowly working narrow dirt paths between warehouses, using sticks to part tall grass, and look for anything hidden. They weren't expecting anything significant, only the what-if kept them going. And then the what-if appeared as a tiny glint in a clump of weeds, right next to a rusted metal fence, a single earring. The person who found it froze, crouched, and examined it closely. A teardrop-shaped earring, silver-plated metal, slightly tarnished, but still reflective enough to catch the weak gray morning light. What caught their attention wasn't the design, but the feeling it didn't belong here. An abandoned industrial site wasn't where people dropped delicate jewelry. It wasn't a park, a busy street or a mall. It was dust, noise and rough labor tools. An earring lying here was like a period on a blank page. No context yet impossible to ignore. The search group immediately contacted police, and within 40 minutes, 2 investigators were on scene to collect the evidence. The earring was picked up with specialized tweezers and placed in a fresh nylon bag. No one dared draw any conclusions. That very restraint made the atmosphere even more serious. Investigator Patterson stared at the earring through the clear plastic and said nothing for several seconds. He asked only one question: "You're sure nobody touched it before we arrived?" They all nodded at once. That caution alone turned it into potentially valuable evidence. Nothing proved the earring belonged to Elena. The family was questioned that same afternoon, but couldn't confirm it either. Elena owned many small pieces of jewelry. Some bought at flea markets, some gifts from friends, and not all were photographed or described in the file. A long-lost earring, or one from a mismatched pair, was entirely possible. But the possibility also ran the other way. It could have fallen off while she was being moved. The real problem was the location. This industrial area had no connection to any direction previously inferred from the evidence. It wasn't between the bar and the lot, where the car was found. It wasn't near Shelby Forest. No one had ever placed Elena there. If it was connected, it suggested the person who took Elena had traveled through far more areas than police realized. That opened a darker question. If the perpetrator's strategy was to scatter points across the map to mislead, this earring could be one more intentional or accidental dot in that chain. In the internal report, the item was listed simply as Z14, single metal earring, origin undetermined. One cold, plain line. Yet when Patterson slipped it into the case file, he felt an indefinable jolt. For the first time in months, with no leads, they had something new, something that wasn't a fading witness memory or invisible speculation. It was physical, tiny, but physical. But physical evidence doesn't speak on its own. And the earring said nothing. It lay sealed in the evidence locker, like an echo from a place police hadn't yet looked. It might mean nothing. It might be the first piece of a section of the puzzle no one knew was missing. The only certainty was this: from that moment on, the abandoned industrial zone was no longer blank space on the investigative map. It became one of the red dots, small but impossible to ignore, that later, when finally connected, would force everyone to see the case in a completely different light. Spring 1995, with Elena's disappearance already fading into distant memory, for most of Memphis, Shelby Forest once again became the center of attention. Not because of progress in the search, but because of a completely chance discovery. A group of teenagers, walking a western trail in a rarely visited part of the forest, stumbled upon what they first thought was an animal skeleton buried under decayed leaves. But when sunlight pierced the canopy and fell on the bone structure, one of them, the son of a medical professional, instantly realized it was not animal. His legs shook as he whispered, "Human. These are human bones." The call went straight to the police department, and in under an hour, the area was sealed off. Yellow tape encircled the small patch where bones protruded among the weeds, as if nature itself had been trying to hide something long forgotten. The lead crime scene technician knelt close to the ground, gently brushing away dry leaves with a pencil. He immediately saw the skull, small, delicate, unmistakably female. What made him freeze for several seconds wasn't just the discovery itself, but the location, barely 300 yards from the sector search teams had swept 2 years earlier. The forest was vast, dense, full of deep hollows and ever-growing vegetation, more than enough to conceal anything for years. If these remains had been here all along, they had likely been completely missed in previous searches. And if they had only recently surfaced, the question was even more chilling: why now? The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office in fragments. Wildlife had scattered many parts, making reconstruction of the original position nearly impossible. But from what remained, forensic anthropologists quickly estimated female, approximately 5 inches tall, skeletal structure, indicating age 24-32. Those numbers made investigator Patterson flinch. Elena fell squarely in that range. But he didn't voice the thought, not out of fear of being wrong, but because he had seen too many cases where premature hope led to wrong conclusions. Patterson ordered additional anthropological tests, long bone measurements, cranial analysis, and checks for old trauma. The victim had a small healed fracture in one rib, possibly from significant impact years before death. That matched a minor 1989 car accident Elena's family had mentioned. But rib fractures are common, thousands of people have them. It wasn't enough. Next came dental records, the standard identification method before widespread DNA testing. They compared Jane Doe's teeth to Elena's last known dental X-rays. Result: no convincing match. Some tooth shapes were similar, but wear patterns and root morphology differed beyond acceptable variance. It didn't completely rule Elena out, but dental comparison couldn't confirm identity. Worse, decomposition had destroyed most dental pulp, meaning no DNA could be extracted with 1995 technology. The medical examiners were left with a vague conclusion: young female, age range matching Elena, identity unconfirmed. No one wanted to hear that, but it was the truth. Police then reviewed records of all women reported missing in the region over the previous 3 years. 4 cases, including Elena's, but none had sufficient dental data for reliable enough for conclusive comparison. Additionally, no personal effects were found with the remains: no clothing, no jewelry, no purse. This heightened the suspicion that the body had either been scattered by animals or moved at some point before full decomposition. In the internal briefing, a young detective suggested pursuing the possibility the remains were Elena's. Patterson looked at him, then at the board, and weighed his words a long time before replying. Not enough evidence, not enough to open a new investigative direction, and not enough to be wrong. That was the case's biggest problem. Anything that could be true could just as easily be false. The space between those two possibilities left was where Elena's case had been trapped from the beginning. Ultimately, the medical examiner labeled the remains Jane Doe 95 SF Shelby Forest, a cold designation in place of a name that once belonged to someone with a family, a life, a story no one now knew. Memphis PD kept the file open but did not link it to Elena's case, not because they didn't consider it, but because science in 1995 wouldn't let them do more. The appearance of Jane Doe 95 SF left some investigators feeling dragged back to Shelby Forest, the same forest that had swallowed every earlier effort to find Elena. Yet when they tried to fit the new facts together, nothing lined up. Elena's car was abandoned northeast of downtown. The remains were northwest. No logical route connected the 2 points, unless the perpetrator crisscrossed the city to mislead. But that was only a theory, unsupported by evidence. Elena's family was informed of the unidentified remains, hope rising and crashing again when told identity could not be confirmed. They still had no answers. Only one more question. The Jane Doe case appeared in the paper once, and quickly sank into silence, like countless other unidentified bodies of the 1990s. But in Elena's file a small note was added next to Jane Doe 95 SF, age consistent, not excluded, not excluded, a state of suspension. A door neither open nor closed, a shadow standing there but never stepping closer. And for many years afterward, Jane Doe 95 SF remained in the file like a piece no one knew where to place. Only when science changed, and Shelby Forest spoke once more, would that piece suddenly light up again. But in 1995 it was merely a symbol of one thing: Elena's case was slowly being worn away by time and without a breakthrough the truth might remain buried in silence forever. By the end of 1995, a bitter reality could no longer be avoided. The Elena Ward case had reached the threshold every investigator dreads, the point where every avenue has been traveled, every question asked, and every answer leads only to a brick wall. No DNA, no witness reliable enough to build a unified timeline, no physical evidence directly linking Elena to a location or a specific person. Even the industrial zone earring, once briefly hoped to open a new path, had been relegated to unable to confirm. The Special Investigative Unit met 3 more times in December to discuss the file's future. Patterson stood at the board, marker in hand, the fatigue of 3 stalled years etched into his face. The words Elena Ward, missing person, were by now too familiar. But what weighed heaviest in the room wasn't those words. It was the blank spaces beneath them, details that could never be filled, questions that could never be answered. The investigative summary listed everything they had: contradictory witness statements about Elena's final movements, vehicle abandoned with no signs of forced entry or struggle, unidentified fabric scraps from Shelby Forest, single earring from the industrial zone, unidentified remains Jane Doe 95 SF, unconfirmable by dental records. Sole remaining potential suspect, Raymond Cole, with an alibi neither provable nor disprovable. Put side by side, none of it formed a path. They were just floating fragments, none heavy enough to pull the case in a decisive direction. Every time they tried to join 2 pieces, the pieces repelled each other like same-pole magnets. Finally, a representative from the legal division had to say what everyone knew but no one wanted to hear: "We cannot continue active investigation without new leads." Those words, harmless individually, together became the temporary period at the end of a 3-year hunt. Patterson looked down at the table, pressed his lips together, and nodded. It was the nod of a man who understood the battle wasn't lost for lack of effort, but for lack of ground left to fight on. On January 12, 1996, the Elena Ward file was officially moved from active investigation to cold case long-term missing person. There was no siren, no special announcement, just a status change in the database, a small shift inside a thick folder, but it felt like a cold breath spreading through the room. Elena's family was notified according to procedure. Police didn't use the word closed, they said suspended, but the family understood. Everyone did. When a disappearance becomes a cold case, everything depends on chance, no longer on active pursuit. If someone calls in new information, the case reopens. If future technology finds something previously missed, they'll try again. Otherwise, the file sits quietly among hundreds of others, waiting for a miracle. But mid-1990s Memphis wasn't a city where miracles happened often. The city was busy, restless, flooded with new violent crimes and disappearances every week. Elena's case slowly sank to the bottom of that current, not because anyone forgot her, but because newer tragedies kept piling on top. Patterson kept a photocopied set of the file in his desk drawer, a habit he had with cases that haunted him. He didn't close the drawer right away. He left it cracked open for weeks, as if closing it would mean closing the last sliver of hope. But time, with its usual coldness, marched on. The drawer was eventually shut, and from that moment, the Elena Ward case entered its longest, darkest, and quietest phase, the period when no detective could do anything more. No new data entered the file, and only the silence of an unanswered name remained. Cold case, a simple term, yet it carries the pain of both helplessness and endless waiting. Elena Ward, the woman who stepped into the darkness behind a bar one early September night, had now officially become one of those mysteries no one knew if or when it would ever be unlocked. Nearly 15 years after the Elena Ward file was moved to cold case status, the dusty cabinets in the MPD basement still held a folder bearing her name, much thinner than most others, yet filled with so many blanks that anyone reading it felt its silence weighed heavier than the thickest files. Stored in the same cabinet was the file for Jane Doe 95 SF, the unidentified remains found in Shelby Forest. No one knew for certain the 2 names were connected, but no one had enough evidence to separate them completely either. For more than a decade, both files lay dormant, waiting for a phone call, a new witness, or some stroke of luck. But when Memphis entered the 2010s, a new kind of hope appeared, not from people, but from technology. Next-generation DNA analysis, capable of resurrecting cases long thought permanently dead. In 2010, the Memphis Police Department began partnering with state-level labs to re-examine old cases, especially those with biological evidence that had been untestable in the past. While flipping through the list, a young forensic assistant noticed the Jane Doe 95 SF file. The 1995 report clearly stated, "No DNA extracted, due to severe decomposition of bone and teeth." But a footnote added, "Future DNA recovery techniques might change the outcome." That single note was enough for her to flag the file in red ink. A small meeting was held at the end of February 2010. The lab suggested that if any dental pulp or dense bone still retained trace organic material, they could attempt mitochondrial DNA retrieval, a method focused on mitochondrial DNA, which is hardier and more resistant to decay than nuclear DNA. It wouldn't give a direct identity, but it could confirm maternal lineage. For an unidentified body, that alone was a major step forward. For the first time in over a decade, Jane Doe's bones were pulled from storage, placed in a specialized container, and transported to the state lab. Bones once dragged by animals and buried for years now lay on gleaming steel tables under cool LED lights, surrounded by nitrile gloves and sterile test tubes. The extraction process was slow and meticulous. Forensic experts chose sections of long leg bone, the part most likely to preserve organic material after many years. The bone was cut into tiny pieces, then pulverized into ultra-fine powder under completely sterile conditions. A faint musty smell of old bone dust hung in the air. No one mentioned it, but it felt as if they were disturbing something. Time had deliberately buried. The first attempt failed. Not enough DNA to amplify. The file simply noted, insufficient material. The second was better but still produced no usable profile. The third, using a more manual purification method, yielded a few scattered met DNA fragments, still not enough for analysis. Only on the fourth try, after applying a low-heat cleaning technique to remove contaminants without destroying remaining DNA, did they obtain what the entire lab had been waiting for, a mitochondrial DNA sequence complete enough for comparison. The results were sent back to MPD with one critical note: mPDNA haplogroup matches a maternal lineage found in the Ward family genealogical record, meaning Jane Doe 95 SF could belong to the same maternal line as Elena Ward. Not 100% confirmation, but a quantum leap from 2 decades of deadlock. The news reached Patterson, now nearing retirement. He held the report and sat silently for a long time. In his career he had seen cases close and reopen, unidentified bodies given names back after decades. But he never thought Elena's case, the one he considered his greatest regret, would rise again, thanks to technology that didn't exist in 1995. The lab recommended further comparison testing with living Ward relatives. That required family consent, so Patterson personally went to the Ward home. When he explained they might have found the first real piece after nearly 20 years, Elena's mother, older, wearier, but eyes still as hard as the first day, said nothing for several seconds. Then she placed a hand on the table and nodded softly. "If that's the only way left to know where my girl is, do it." A sample from Elena's maternal niece was taken and analyzed within 6 weeks. Result: perfect match on the mitochondrial line. Not enough to declare Jane Doe 95 SF definitively Elena Ward, but enough to confirm the remains belonged to the Ward maternal line. This was a result no one had in 1995, or even 2005. But by 2012 it was milestone enough for MPD to partially reopen the file. A large meeting was held. Young investigators, many still in high school when Elena vanished, now sat beside Patterson reviewing every old page. They spread the map on the table: location where the car was found, location of the fabric scraps, location of the unidentified remains. No straight line connected them clearly, but now they at least knew Jane Doe 95 SF was most likely not a separate case. In subsequent meetings, experts began asking bigger questions. If Jane Doe was Elena, Why was she in Shelby Forest? How could she get from Beale Street there without anyone seeing? Was the car moved as a deliberate misdirection? And most importantly, who had both the time and the territory to do it? That last question brought Raymond Cole's name back into the file. This time not because of vague witness statements, but because new data was reshaping Elena's route. In the 2010 Memphis began digitizing all 911 records, archived maps, and old traffic routes. A team of young technicians was able to reconstruct the 1992 street grid, including trails, demolished roads, and narrow lanes that no longer appeared on modern maps. This let them do what the previous generation could not: model the perpetrator's possible movements based on the actual city layout of the time, not guesswork. When the new data was fed into the model, something unexpected appeared: the shortest route from the parking lot where Elena's car was found to Shelby Forest passed directly by Raymond Cole's church. Not proof, not a conclusion, but a coincidence strong enough for one young detective to blurt, "How did we never see this before?" The answer was simple: in 1992, they had no detailed satellite maps, no route data, no reconstruction technology. Everything was guesswork and human memory. But now technology had given them a map of the past, and that map pointed to a coordinate they had once overlooked. In 2018, Patterson, now retired, visited the investigative unit one last time to look at the case. A young detective showed him the new map. Patterson stared so long everyone thought he hadn't heard. Then he said slowly, "We never step into the same forest twice, but sometimes, the forest comes looking for us." The Elena Ward case began its second life, not because of a witness, not because of a confession, but because of something that had lain silent for 25 years, and suddenly found its voice. The DNA of Jane Doe 95 SF, and from that point on, the truth buried by time began surfacing layer by layer, slowly, but unstoppable. Nearly a decade after mitochondrial DNA first cracked the door open, the Elena Ward case still hovered in gray territory, not enough to confirm, not enough to deny. Shelby Forest remained a silent shadow in the file. Patterson had retired. Younger investigators carried the case with a mix of patience and unease. They knew meta-DNA only proved maternal lineage, not individual identity. Only true nuclear DNA could end all doubt. But Jane Doe 95 SF's bones were heavily degraded, and the 2010 extraction attempts had already consumed nearly the last organic material. Yet 2021 proved one thing: science does not stand still. Forensic genetic genealogy, the tool that had cracked dozens of long-dormant cases across America, was now being applied to old Tennessee files. Memphis PD, in an effort to revive key cold cases, selected Elena's, not because they were certain Jane Doe was Elena, but because it was the only unidentified remains case with mtDNA matching a specific maternal line. In other words, among hundreds of Jane Does, only 95 SF had a real, if narrow, door leading back to the Ward family. The rest depended on what FGG does best: finding distant relatives. The tiniest remaining extractable DNA sample from the bones was sent to a lab partnered with GED Match Pro, the platform that allows investigators access to massive genealogical databases uploaded voluntarily by the public. No one dared hope too much. The degraded state of the sample meant results could be faint or useless, but science sometimes has its own way of delivering leaps no one expects. When the DNA profile was uploaded, the system ran automated comparisons for hours. Then, on a June morning in 2021, the screen showed the first result: a match at the third, fourth cousin level, a distant but real relative. That match came from someone living in Arkansas who had uploaded their DNA to learn about family origins. They had no idea they were related to anyone in Memphis, much less that they were about to become the most crucial piece in a 30-year-old case. The interview was conducted by phone. The relative knew nothing about Elena Ward, but when Elena's mother's name, Margaret Ward, was mentioned, he said that name had appeared in a distant branch his great-grandmother once spoke of. Though faint, it was enough for the genealogist to spiral outward, building the Ward family tree from that small match, layering in birth years, residences, minor family migrations. And then the picture sharpened. The DNA from Jane Doe 95SF fit perfectly within the Ward lineage, and the closest match pointed directly to Elena. To solidify it, investigators obtained reference samples from 2 more of Elena's nieces from different maternal branches. 1 month later, the results came back with certainty, far beyond mtDNA. Nuclear DNA established a 99.999% probability that the unidentified remains were Elena Ward. 30 years after the night she walked into that dark alley, Memphis finally knew where she had gone. Police held a small, low-key press conference. The case was too old. Most media barely remembered Elena's name. But in a small room at MPD, the young investigator's eyes shone with the feeling only cold case detectives truly understand, the sensation of pulling someone out of time's darkness, giving them back their name, giving them back their existence. For the Ward family, the moment wasn't light breaking through darkness. It was light shining on a wound that had been forced closed long ago. Elena's mother, voice hoarse from years of waiting, said only, "At last my girl has come home to us." The only way she still could. But inside MPD, the result carried even greater weight. The disappearance was now officially a homicide. No more possible, no more assumed, no more not excluded. Elena's body in Shelby Forest, a place she had no reason to be. That could only have happened because a human hand put her there. Investigators reopened the map, looked at the route from the abandoned car to the remains site, then looked again at the location of Raymond Cole's church, still sitting directly on that route. The meaningless scribbles of 1995 had suddenly become shapes with meaning, a deliberate route, familiar territory, a pattern consistent with someone who wanted every trace erased. From 2021 onward, the Elena Ward case was no longer just a heartbreaking entry in the missing persons files. It was officially a homicide, with an identified victim, remains restored to their name, and a perpetrator who might still be living somewhere in the city. A case once worn away by time had been given new life, but with that life came a new storm of investigation about to break. And at the eye of that storm stood a name, whose suspicion had never faded: Raymond Cole. With the 2021 DNA confirmation in hand, the new investigative team no longer viewed the Elena Ward case as a vague disappearance. To them, Elena had not simply vanished. She had been taken to Shelby Forest, and that meant the entire 1992 timeline had to be rewritten from scratch. The old guard had once called Elena's case too clean, but the new generation saw it differently. Not clean. We were just standing in the wrong place to see it. And so, nearly 30 years after the night Elena left the bar, the case was rebuilt using tools Patterson and his 1992 colleagues could never have imagined: time-stamped GPS simulation, streetlight analysis based on historical urban data, digitized terrain reconstruction of the city, and predictive modeling of the offender's possible routes based on criminal movement behavior. It all started with what seemed like a simple question: if Elena's car was moved, which direction did the perpetrator take it? A GIS specialist team was brought in. They reconstructed the 1992 Memphis street grid, not just the main roads, but every alley, dead-end temporary lot, and cleared area that no longer existed. They combined archived traffic department records, old satellite imagery, aerial city photos, and construction logs to create a fully digitized model of Memphis exactly as it stood that fall. When the model was finished, the youngest detective on the team said only, "We're looking at the Memphis Elena saw." From there they began rebuilding every minute of the old timeline: the moment Elena left the bar, the instant she stepped into the alley, the unlit stretch at the end of the alley, the area outside camera range, possible routes from the alley to the lot where the car was later found. But when they ran the simulation, something made the entire room fall silent. There was no logical route Elena could have driven herself to the lot where the car was discovered. If she had walked to her usual parking spot, she would have turned left out of the alley and gone straight. But the model showed that to reach the distant lot, she would have had to turn right, walk 2 completely dark blocks in 1992, and cross a corner filled with shuttered bars, a place known only for theft and drunks after midnight. No one would choose that route late at night, unless forced or deliberately misled. The model then analyzed 1992 street lighting. The GIS team pulled power company records to pinpoint every functioning lamp at the time. A thin ring of dim light appeared on the model, exactly where the second witness had said Elena paused. This confirmed a chilling reality. Someone standing in the dark could choose the perfect moment to approach without being seen. The rebuilt timeline finally made sense. Elena exits the bar, enters the dark zone, is intercepted in the few seconds a witness heard but could not clearly see. The offender quickly gains control. Elena never reaches her own car. The team moved to the second question: where did the perpetrator take Elena first? They analyzed 1992 traffic data, partly from accident reports, partly from old traffic signal maps. One pattern emerged immediately. If the offender wanted to leave the Beale Street area fastest, while avoiding traffic, the natural direction was northeast, and that exact direction led to the area where Elena's Toyota was later found. But the model didn't stop there. They calculated light levels on every possible route late at night, which streets were dark enough for the offender to go unnoticed. Every path led to the same conclusion. The driver had to be intimately familiar with 1992 Memphis, knew every shortcut, knew every dark corner, knew the places no one paid attention to. A young detective asked, "So where did the perpetrator take Elena after dumping the car?" That question led to the most striking part of the model: the route from the abandoned car lot to Shelby Forest. The software analyzed 13 possible routes, eliminated those with too many traffic lights, eliminated those with regular police patrols, and finally displayed the 3 optimal paths. All 3, despite minor differences, shared one detail that made the room hold its breath. Every single one passed directly by the church where Pastor Raymond Cole worked. Not evidence, not a conclusion, but an overlap impossible to ignore. Patterson, invited back as a consultant, stared at the highlighted route on the screen. He said nothing for almost a minute, but every young detective in the room understood. In investigations there are moments when words aren't needed. The silence of a man who gave his life to a case is its own kind of confirmation. Still, the team refused to rush. They knew instinct is not proof, so they reopened every 1992 witness statement, statements that had once seemed so contradictory they were nearly useless. But now, under the light of new data, the fragments of memory began fitting together. Witness 1 said Elena walked alone. That now perfectly matched the model because the approach happened after she entered the dark zone. Witness 2 heard a scuffing sound. The light model showed that was the only spot it could have happened. Witness 3 saw a dark blue pickup. The route model showed that was the only direction the truck could have appeared, and still matched the car dump location. 3 statements that once contradicted each other now aligned in a way no one had expected. And when 3 statements aligned, the suspect emerged from pure logic, not emotion, not hunch, but digitized data, movement analysis, and criminal behavior science. The perpetrator was not a stranger. He belonged to the area, knew 1992 Memphis like the back of his hand, was active at night, had reason to be near Beale Street without drawing attention, worked along the most logical route. One name in the file met every single criterion, quietly, but unmistakably: Raymond Cole. But the problem wasn't only Cole. The model also produced one more prediction. The offender did not act in haste. Panic. He knew how to move a victim without leaving evidence. This was not the behavior of an opportunist. This was the behavior of someone prepared, and that conclusion opened an entirely new investigative direction. Cole might not have been the only person involved. There could be a second individual, one the model had not yet named, but whose actions had left footprints in the gaps of a timeline, more than 30 years old. The Elena Ward case, after 3 decades, finally had a real timeline, and that timeline was anything but gentle. It pointed to the hand of someone familiar, careful, and possibly standing in the darkness the very moment Elena stepped into the alley in 1992. Once the reconstructed 1992 timeline began revealing a coherent picture, the team realized they could no longer maintain the sprawling suspect list of the past. Once the roots had shape, the hypotheses had to narrow accordingly. 30 years earlier, Memphis PD had built its suspect list mostly on scattered statements and gut feelings about who might be involved. But now, they had solid data, routes, timing, lighting, access zones, and especially the corridor linking Beale Street to Shelby Forest, a corridor the offender almost certainly knew well. In the 1992 file, the three most prominent original suspects had been 1. Earl Bledsoe, night shift worker in the industrial area near where the earring was found. 2. Darren Hughes, bartender who worked with Elena, reportedly the last person to speak to her before she left. 3. Raymond Cole, pastor of a small church. His name surfaced in several vague statements, and his timeline could never be verified. 30 years later, the new team went back to those three men, not because they were old suspects, but because they were the only ones physically inside Elena's radius that night. This time the approach was completely different. The 1992 file had listed Earl Bledsoe as a person of interest simply because he worked near the industrial zone where the earring appeared. When the earring surfaced in 1994, many old-school detectives suspected a night worker in that area could have passed by, spotted Elena, or been connected to the item. But the new team decided to test it with data, instead of guesswork. They tracked down payroll records, time clock logs, and even punch cards from the long-closed factory where Bledsoe worked. In an old storage warehouse, they found digitized time clock records, something no one in 1992 thought to look for. Results: Bledsoe clocked in at 8:02 p.m., clocked out at 3:56 a.m. Internal, old but preserved analog security footage showed him inside the plant the entire shift. That destroyed the original suspicion. He never left the factory during the window. Elena disappeared. His presence near the industrial zone was pure coincidence, not a red herring. Earl Bledsoe cleared. Darren Hughes had once been a prime suspect, simply because he was the last person to speak with Elena. Some even speculated unrequited feelings, and that became a popular theory: acquaintance, conflict, impulsive act. But the new timeline model changed everything. When they analyzed Darren's schedule using bar records, shift end times, POS transactions, and remaining staff statements, the team uncovered a crucial fact. Darren was still inside the bar when Elena walked out the back door. Final transactions under his name were logged after 11:20 p.m. A witness confirmed seeing Darren clearing tables the exact moment Elena disappeared from view. This was reinforced by the new lighting model. No one placed Darren in the alley, and the only surviving front door camera footage showed him exiting the main entrance roughly 20 minutes after Elena had already vanished from the blind spot. Even the old detectives who once suspected him had to admit, Darren could not be in two places at once, neither in 1992 nor in 2022. Darren Hughes, cleared. When the first two suspects were cleared by data, forensic evidence, and timeline logic, only Raymond Cole remained, the man who had always lingered in the gray zone for 3 decades. Nothing new about him in the 1992 file. No direct evidence, no identifying witness, no incriminating trace. But investigation isn't always about what is there, sometimes it's about what isn't. And the one thing that hadn't changed from 1992 to 2021 was this: Cole had no verifiable alibi. In 1992, he said he stayed at the church until around 9 p.m., then went home. In 2021, no witness could confirm that. No cameras, no records, no activity proving his location during Elena's disappearance window. But more importantly, every simulated offender route passed right by Cole's church area. Not one route, not two routes, all three most viable ones. Combined with the light model and timeline unifying the contradictory witness statements, a clearer picture emerged. The offender was familiar with the Beale Street area, knew the dark shortcuts in 1992, had legitimate reason to be around downtown at night, could approach Elena without drawing attention, could control her car and move it to another lot. Raymond Cole fit every single criterion, not through emotional guesswork like in 1992, but through hard data analysis. Lead investigator Everly said one sentence that silenced the room: 29 years ago, we had 3 men. Today only one man can't prove he wasn't there. Cole wasn't charged then, that required DNA evidence. But for the first time, he was no longer one of many suspects. He became the sole suspect at the center of the 1992 murder model. Not because of instinct, not because of bias, but because of logic. Logic written in streetlight data, digitized maps, alibi gaps, and witness fragments now fitting perfectly into place. And the team understood, they had narrowed the suspect pool. Now they needed the one thing the case had lacked for 3 decades, evidence directly tying Cole to Elena. That piece was about to surface, but before it did, the truth had to venture into the deepest darkness of the case. Once the investigation narrowed to a single suspect without an alibi, the team knew they were walking a razor's edge between substantiated instinct and true legal proof. The data models reconstructed timeline, viable routes, church location overlap, all pointed to Raymond Cole. But to bring a 3-decade-old case to arrest, they needed what 1992 didn't have: physical evidence. And of all evidence types, only one is irrefutable: DNA. Investigator Everly made a bold call: collect trash DNA from Cole, something he couldn't control and didn't require a warrant for. Not because he was illegally suspected, but because the law allows DNA from discarded public items, like coffee cups, cigarette butts, tissues, water bottles. This tactic had cracked other cold cases, and now it was Elena's turn. A covert surveillance team was deployed around the old church where Cole still preached. Cole was elderly now, hair mostly gray, but his habits hadn't changed. Every morning, he stopped at a small coffee shop near the church, ordered his usual black, no sugar, then walked a few minutes to a park bench to drink it. That routine was the opportunity the team had waited for. In early April 2022, on a chilly morning, Cole finished his coffee and tossed the paper cup into a public trash bin. Less than a minute later, an undercover detective approached, retrieved the cup into an evidence bag, sealed it, coded it, and sent it straight to the state lab. Every step was documented on video for legal chain of custody. When the cup sample reached the lab, technicians expanded the process. They isolated the rim, swabbed the surface with micro swabs, and recovered a small amount of epithelial cells, just enough to amplify. After 3 decades, they finally had what the case had never possessed: a complete nuclear DNA profile of the prime suspect. But the most crucial part was yet to come. In the 1992 file, there was one small piece of evidence, once dismissed as not useful: a faint hand smudge on the dashboard of Elena's Toyota. Back then, technology wasn't sensitive enough to generate a DNA profile from that surface. The report stated, no usable biological material, but in 2022, touch DNA techniques could work with just a few shed cells. The DNA sample from Cole's coffee cup was compared to the old sample collected from Elena's car, the sample that had sat dormant for 30 years, never expected to be revived. The lab ran the machine overnight. The investigative team didn't sleep. A 30-year cold case could stay cold, another 30 years if the results didn't match. But if they did, even partially, the case would cross a point of no return. The next morning, Everly received the lab notification. The words on the screen were short, cold, but carried the weight of thunder. DNA match. Probability exceeds 1 in 2.3 billion. Not random coincidence. Not possible. It was Cole who had been inside Elena's car, and there was no innocent explanation for that. For the first time in 30 years, the case had physical evidence directly linking the suspect to the victim. No longer just logical data, no longer just probability models, no longer just fuzzy statements. This was truth etched into evidence that time couldn't erase. When Everly saw the report, he said only, "We've passed the point of no return." The instant the DNA matched, Raymond Cole was no longer just the prime suspect. He became the accused in the eyes of science, and Memphis knew the arrest was coming very soon. Once the DNA from Raymond Cole's coffee cup matched the touch DNA inside Elena's car, the investigative team knew they had reached the heart of the case. But to charge someone in a 3-decade cold case, DNA alone wasn't enough. They needed to prove behavior, needed to show a jury that the car wasn't random, but part of a deliberate criminal process. That led to the next step, analyzing the movement of Elena Ward's 1991 Toyota Corolla. The 1992 file noted the car's position when found, a public lot off Poplar Avenue, over a mile from where Elena vanished. But back then, police lacked vehicle movement reconstruction technology. They simply recorded the car as parked neatly, no damage, meaning there was no reason to look closer. But now, with the case reclassified as homicide, the question was reframed: did Elena really drive the car to its final location? Lead investigator Everly brought in 2 forensic vehicle dynamics experts to analyze the 1992 records, combined with 2022 simulations. What they uncovered sent the entire team back to the parking lot, possibly to a puzzle piece their predecessors had overlooked 30 years ago. When old scene photos were fed into the AI analysis system, the team spotted details human eyes in 1992 couldn't detect. Red clay soil, clinging to Elena's rear tires. That soil type didn't exist in the Beale Street area where she disappeared, but matched the dirt along roads near Shelby Forest, meaning the car had driven through the terrain leading to the remains site before ending up in the Poplar lot. There was no way Elena drove to Shelby Forest and back downtown. By then she was already missing. A young detective blurted, the offender used the car to transport Elena, or something connected to her. Forensic vehicle dynamics continued by simulating steering wheel angles based on the car's found position. From the front wheel angle and steering wheel adjustment before shutdown, they noticed something odd. The wheel was tilted 17 degrees left. That's the angle drivers use for a slight curve into a tight spot, typical of someone familiar with parking in Memphis's older lots in the 1990s. Elena didn't park that way. Friends had stated she preferred straight-in parking, with minimal steering. That tiny difference, under forensics, became a key indicator. The driver wasn't Elena. The technicians simulated the full parking maneuver. There was a sharp left turn from the lot entrance to the spot, a curve that would make an unfamiliar driver brake hard or overcorrect the wheel. But the simulation showed a turn too smooth for a stranger. The vehicle dynamics expert said, he wasn't wondering where he was going. He knew the path exactly. The old file noted slightly low front tire pressure. When the forensics team analyzed the tires, they pointed out what no one noticed in 1992. The front tire deflation wasn't from weather, it was from driving over Shelby Forest rough roads. The route to the 1992 remains site had loose gravel, prone to causing front tire pressure drops. The Poplar lot where the car was found was in a smooth paved urban area, not enough to cause that deflation. The conclusion emerged clearly: the car had been driven to Shelby Forest before being returned to the Poplar lot. This piece, when slotted into the timeline, carried the weight of the offender's signature. After simulating the route, the team built a behavioral driving model of the offender. No abrupt turns, no unusual acceleration, no scratches on the body, no uncontrolled stops. In other words, he wasn't panicked, not the profile of an impulsive offender. He knew how to drive at night, knew forest roads, and especially, knew how to park without drawing attention. When the team layered behavioral data into the model, it pointed to a profile matching one man. The offender was someone who drove long distances at night, familiar with the Poplar and Shelby Forest areas, and maintained composure when handling vehicles. That information aligned perfectly with Raymond Cole's background. He frequently traveled between the church, the forest for retreats, and northern Memphis neighborhoods. Once again, the logical model led straight back to Cole. For the first time in 30 years, the pieces didn't just suggest, they unanimously told the same story. Soil marks: the car had been to Shelby Forest. Steering angle, driven by someone familiar with the area. Tire pressure returned from rough roads before parking. Touch DNA. Cole himself touched the dashboard. Elena's car, once seen as nothing more than something left behind, had now become a physical witness, speaking the words Elena could no longer say. She never drove away from that lot on her own. Someone took her, and that someone drove her car as if it were his own. Investigator Everly closed the thick folder and told the team, "We're no longer looking for the killer, we're proving what he did." And with the forensic vehicle evidence in hand, The path to charging Cole entered an irreversible phase. The day the arrest warrant for Raymond Cole was signed, Memphis woke to a morning no one in the city would ever forget. For months, the team had gathered every fragment, every trace, every tiny signal pointing to the prime suspect, and when the DNA from the coffee cup matched the touch DNA inside Elena's car, everything became chillingly clear. But clarity didn't mean ease. No one at MPD felt relief knowing the man they were about to cuff wasn't a street criminal, wasn't a repeat offender, but a pastor who had preached to hundreds, still called Pastor Cole with reverence by an entire community. But at 6 a.m., the law doesn't look at titles, it only looks at truth. Just before dawn, armored vehicles rolled silently, no sirens, no lights, and stopped in front of a quiet Raleigh neighborhood. The sky was still foggy, pale light fell on sleeping windows. The SWAT team in black armor, ballistic helmets, less lethal weapons ready, moved like shadows, fast, precise, not a wasted word. Every step had been rehearsed. One mistake could make 3 decades of investigation vanish like smoke. Cole's wooden front door became the focal point of the entire operation's tension. The SWAT commander pounded 3 times, the sound shattering the street's silence. Memphis police, open the door, we have a warrant. No one on the team knew how Cole would react. Some suspects surrender calmly, but others use that moment to take their own life. Some run, some fight, some lose their minds completely. But Raymond Cole, the 68-year-old pastor who had preached for nearly 3 decades, simply opened the door slowly, so slowly, one officer thought he didn't understand what was happening. He was in pajamas, silver hair disheveled, face gaunt from sleeplessness. His eyes met the SWAT team without panic, without anger, without denial. Just a strange emptiness, like a man accepting something he knew would come eventually. When the cuffs clicked on Cole's wrists, doors along the street began to crack open. Neighbors didn't interfere, they just wanted to understand why their dawn had been torn apart by a scene they'd never witnessed. An elderly woman, who had lived next to Cole for 20 years, asked shakily, "No, it can't be Pastor Cole, you've got the wrong man." A middle-aged man whispered, "He prayed over my mother. I can't believe this." Those eyes didn't see Pastor Cole as a criminal. They saw a familiar figure being ripped from a role they had believed was real for decades. The collapse of trust happened right in front of them, fragile, painful, and bewildering. Cole, hands cuffed behind his back, said nothing, a silence that unsettled veteran officers more than resistance ever could. News spread like wildfire. By the time SWAT walked Cole to the vehicle, parishioners were already gathering outside the church he had served for 26 years. Some sobbed uncontrollably, some were too stunned to stand. A young woman clutched her Bible. "Pastor Cole could never do that. He saved my life." Those words weren't defending a criminal. They were the cries of people whose moral foundation had just been yanked out from under them. The church stayed closed that day. No one was calm enough to preach when the man who stood at the pulpit was being read his Miranda rights. In less than 30 minutes, from local papers to national networks, the story exploded. A young reporter shouted into a microphone, "Officer, is this related to the 1992 disappearance of Elena Ward?" No officer answered, but their silence, and the image of Raymond Cole being placed in the car, was enough for the entire country to understand. Memphis's most important cold case had just been cracked. That night, every major channel ran blazing headlines. "Pastor arrested in 30-year-old homicide case. Most shocking arrest in Memphis in decades." A pastor arrested for the suspected murder of a woman missing 3 decades. Missing, the story alone was powerful enough to pierce every media barrier. Michael Ward, Elena's brother, had been called by investigator Everly just before the operation. Michael arrived on scene as Cole was escorted to the car. He stood behind the yellow tape, eyes locked on the silver-haired man walking with his head bowed. For 30 years Michael had imagined countless versions of the killer. A stranger, a drifter, an addict, but never once a pastor. He stood frozen, hands clenched, lips trembling, chest heaving as if he couldn't breathe. An officer beside him whispered, "Breathe, Michael." But when the car door slammed, and the engine started, something inside Michael shattered. He sank onto a bench, hands covering his face. Not pure joy, because 30 years of tension, 30 years of swallowed grief, 30 years of waiting had finally found their stopping point. Everly placed a hand on his shoulder. We kept our word. We never gave up. That day, Memphis learned that justice can arrive 30 years late, but when it does, it shakes an entire city. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a moral earthquake, a truth stripped bare, a community forced to stare at the man they had trusted. And in that shock, the Ward family finally had what they hadn't possessed since 1992, hope that the truth had finally spoken. Raymond Cole was led into MPD interrogation room 4 at 8:42 a.m. Just over 2 hours after being cuffed on his own doorstep. He offered no resistance, didn't immediately demand a lawyer, didn't cry or rage like many suspects. Suddenly arrested after decades of living as good people, he simply sat in the metal chair, back straight, hands still trembling slightly, but eyes strangely vacant, as if he had spent the entire night and the last 3 decades without sleep. Investigators Everly and Holloway entered. They placed the thick file in front of Cole. On top was a photo of Elena Ward, taken in 1992, bright smile, lightly curled hair, eyes young and alive, so vivid that when the picture lay beside Raymond Cole, she seemed like a spirit staring straight through him. Everly began, voice slow but ice cold. "Mr. Cole, your DNA was found inside Elena Ward's car. The sample from the coffee cup matches at 1 in 2.3 billion. Do you have an explanation?" Cole looked at the photo, not with guilty eyes, but with the gaze of a man who had seen this moment in his head for a very long time. He closed his eyes, straightened slightly, and spoke his first words since arrest. "I knew this would happen eventually." No one in the interrogation room expected that, even less did they expect what he said next. Everly slid the reconstructed GPS route diagram in front of him. "You drove Elena's car. We know the car went to Shelby Forest before returning to Poplar. We know it was you." Cole studied the map as if revisiting an old memory. His fingers rested on the table, tapping lightly, not anxious rhythm, but the cadence of a man deciding how much to reveal. "Do you think I did it alone?" Cole asked, voice even, no tremor, no defiance. The room went dead silent for a beat. Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Are you saying someone else was involved?" Cole, of course there was. The air in the interrogation room seemed to freeze. Months of investigation, every data point pointing to Cole as the lone killer, his DNA in the car, the roots matching, no alibi. Yet now Cole spoke as if he were only one cog in the machine behind Elena's death. Everly leaned forward. "Be specific." Cole exhaled, not the sigh of a man about to confess, but the exhale of someone finally setting down a burden carried too long. "I didn't approach Elena in the alley. I wasn't the first to touch her car. I wasn't the one who took her to the forest." Holloway, furious. "Are you trying to spread the blame? You think we'll buy that just to lighten your sentence?" Cole shook his head. "I'm not asking for anything lighter. I know I'll die in prison, but if you think catching me is the end, Elena will never get real justice." Everly replied, "You can give us the other person's name." Cole, "He's dead." Silence. The kind of silence that makes hearts beat faster, because it usually precedes a crueler truth. Cole tilted his head, studying Everly as if weighing how much he truly wanted to reveal. "If I give you the name, you'll reopen 10 other cases, and I'm not sure Memphis is ready for that." Everly gripped his pen. "What game are you playing?" Cole answered instantly, "I'm not playing, I'm telling the truth I've hidden for 30 years. Cole began to speak, not with drama, but in the same even tone he might have used to deliver an old sermon. "I didn't approach Elena, I was called in to handle things. The car wasn't moved by me the first time. He knew Elena. I didn't. I got involved because I thought I was helping a friend who was panicking. I was wrong. I was wrong the moment I touched that steering wheel." Everly asked, "Which friend? Who?" Cole stared at the table. A minute passed like an hour. Then he said slowly, "His name was Matthew Keller." Everly flipped quickly through old cold case files. No such name. Holloway, confused, what was his connection to Elena? Cole, "They met at a church event. I didn't pay attention. He became obsessed with her. I only found out after everything was too late." At that moment the room filled with a mix of shock, frustration, and the feeling of being shoved back to square one. Everly, when did Keller die? Cole answered instantly, 1998, car accident. You can check. Holloway typed notes, hand shaking from the rush of emotions. You're saying he was the primary offender? Cole, no, I'm saying he started the story, but I'm the one who ended it. The interrogation pivoted immediately. If Cole wasn't the first to approach Elena, then where was the other person's DNA? Everly asked the one question that finally made Cole flinch. There's a second unidentified DNA sample in the car. Is it Matthew Keller's? Cole went silent, a different kind of silence this time. The kind that comes when someone is backed into a corner. Holloway slammed his hand on the table. You know the answer. Cole closed his eyes, a long heavy exhale. Yes. That single word became the epicenter of everything that followed. Cole continued. Keller panicked. He told me to help move the car, help him hide everything. I foolishly believed him. I thought it was just an accident, just a crisis. I didn't know if Elena was still alive. I didn't dare ask. Everly narrowed his eyes. You transported her body. Cole looked straight at him. I drove the car into the forest. He followed, but he was the one who brought Elena there. The room turned ice cold. When Cole uttered the confession no one saw coming, that he had not acted alone, Everly felt the ground shift beneath his feet. One lone suspect had just become two. One offender dead since 1998. A second unidentified DNA sample. And a new question. If Keller did this to Elena, who else did he do it to? This was no longer the end of the case. It was the beginning of another storm. In the internal report after the interrogation, Everly wrote exactly 2 lines. Cole was involved, but not alone. The second DNA must now become absolute priority. The Elena Ward case, believed to have found its sole perpetrator, suddenly widened in a completely different direction, one no investigator had imagined, when they arrested Raymond Cole on his doorstep, and Memphis had no idea what it was about to face. All they knew was this: for 30 years, they had only touched half the truth. The trial of Raymond Cole began in November 2023, almost exactly 31 years to the day after the night Elena Ward walked into the alley behind the bar and vanished from the world. Courtroom 7 at the Shelby County Courthouse was packed from the early hours. Not only the Ward family, but Memphians who had grown up haunted by the 1992 disappearance, were there too. Cole's entrance, white hair visibly thinner, tightened the air even further. He walked in without looking at the gallery, without searching for anyone, and simply sat in the defendant's chair as if he knew every pair of eyes was already fixed on him. Shelby County District Attorney Marissa Hale stood and opened the trial with a sentence that silenced the room. We are not here to tell a story. We are here to deliver science, truth, and 30 years of waiting for justice. From that moment on, every piece of evidence, once scattered across 3 decades, was threaded together into an indictment impossible to refute. D.A. Hale began with the strongest weapon, the touch DNA from Elena Ward's car. A giant screen displayed DNA profile recovered from the 1991 Toyota dashboard, DNA profile from Cole's discarded coffee cup, matching analysis graph, with a probability of 1 in 2.3 billion. Hale stated plainly, there is no innocent explanation for the defendant's DNA in that location. Defense counsel tried to counter with secondary transfer arguments that Cole might have touched an intermediary object, but Hale was ready. She displayed the forensic simulation. The DNA was deep under the plastic edge, only possible if the driver had rested his hand directly on the shifter and console. Not coincidence, not secondary transfer, not I don't remember. It was the evidence of the person who drove the car. Cole bowed his head and said nothing. Next, Hale presented evidence police in 1992 had barely noticed: red clay soil in the grooves of Elena's rear tires. The soil was compared to Beale Street area, no match. Poplar Avenue lot, where the car was found, no match. Soil on the access road into Shelby Forest, perfect match in grain, mineral, and organic composition, a forensic geologist testified. This vehicle definitely entered the forest where the remains were later found before being parked in the poplar lot. Defense counsel asked whether Elena could have driven there herself. The expert replied, no, because the soil is on the rear tires, and tire pressure differential shows the car traveled rough roads and then returned to the city with already depressed tires. The driver had to be extremely familiar with the route. In the Ward family row, Michael closed his eyes. What they had always sensed was now spoken aloud in court. DA Hale didn't drown the jury in technicalities. She showed them clear visuals, a 3D simulation of 1992, Memphis reconstructed from digitized maps, traffic records, lighting data and terrain. She pointed to each spot: alley behind the bar, last place Elena was seen, the 17-second unlit stretch, where a witness heard the scuffing sound, the offender's optimal route with the car Shelby Forest, the return route to Poplar to mislead investigators. Every path past Cole's church. One juror couldn't stop taking notes. Hale concluded, the defendant knew roads most Memphians in 1992 didn't even know existed. This was not the victim's route. This was the route of the person who orchestrated her disappearance. Hale called her first witness, the man who lived above the alley in 1992. He testified, I saw the girl walk under the flickering light. I heard a sound like someone being stopped. Second witness, the person who once reported seeing a dark blue pickup on the empty stretch, matching the make Keller owned before dying in 1998. In 1992, those statements contradicted each other. Now, under the forensic light and timeline model, they aligned perfectly. Hale showed the sound location matching the lighting blind spot, the blue pickup location matching Keller's known work route, the exact time Elena vanished, matching the window. Cole had no alibi for defense counsel objected. Witness memory can be wrong after 30 years, Hale replied, but science is not wrong after 30 years. The crime scene reconstruction expert demonstrated how the offender moved Elena, based on tire tracks, steering wheel angle, Forest Road segment, and the time required to return to Poplar. He presented the model, Lina subdued in the alley, placed in the first vehicle, Keller's pickup, later transferred to her own car. Cole drove her car to Shelby Forest, Keller followed to finish it. DA Hale did not show images of the remains, no need. The evidence was already crushing. Cole stared at the table. He no longer argued, no longer looked at the jury, no longer looked at the prosecutor. He seemed to be watching his own collapse. When the DA finished her presentation, she delivered her closing line, not loudly, not harshly, just the quiet of a blade touching stone. We are not convicting with theories. We are convicting with science, with logic, with time. And science says defendant Raymond Cole helped take Elena Ward's life. No one in the courtroom could deny that forensic chain, because it rested on things that don't lie. DNA doesn't misspeak. Soil doesn't change color on its own. Tires don't deflate by themselves. Streetlights don't move. Time doesn't rewrite itself. Cole finally looked up. His face was ashen. He spoke only one sentence, voice hoarse and desperate. I told you. I wasn't alone, but that sentence didn't save him. It only opened more charges, and more victims, for the next phase. The trial moved to deliberation. Memphis waited for the verdict, and the Ward family, for the first time in 30 years, felt justice was no longer out of reach. The day Raymond Cole was sentenced, the air in the courtroom was so heavy, it could be felt in every breath. Not a single empty seat. Hundreds of Memphians crowded the hallways waiting for news. 31 years after Elena Ward disappeared, justice stood at its final moment, the moment the city had never dared hope for, yet had never stopped waiting for. Cole was brought in wearing the orange prison jumpsuit, wrists showing cuff marks. He looked older than he had a month earlier, back slightly stooped, eyes weary, face so gaunt that even those who once trusted him most had to look away. No more Pastor Cole, no more spiritual father of a small congregation. Before the state of Tennessee, he had only one identity left, Raymond Cole, defendant charged with first-degree murder. The door opened, the 12 jurors filed in single file. None looked at Cole, none looked at the Ward family. They walked as if carrying the weight of 30 years of truth on their shoulders. The judge asked the question the entire room had waited 3 months to hear. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreperson nodded and handed over the envelope. The judge opened it, eyes scanning the paper. That brief second stretched like a lifetime for Michael Ward, gripping his mother's hand in the front row. Then the judge read, voice clear. We find the defendant, Raymond Cole, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted in sharp breaths, some choked sobs, some whispered. Finally, a woman in the back row covered her mouth and sobbed. One of Cole's former parishioners stared at the floor, shaking his head in pain and horror. Cole closed his eyes, face twitching for a moment, not from shock, but because the sentence had finally taken physical form, no longer just a prediction or rumor. He had known it was coming, but no one is ever ready for the day their own judgment arrives. Judge Clayton, who had overseen every day of the trial, raised the sentence and looked directly at the defendant, Cole. The evidence in this case: DNA, forensic vehicle analysis, soil matching, timeline reconstruction, all leads to one conclusion: you directly participated in the death of Elena Ward and concealed that crime for 30 years. He paused, letting the truth ring in the silent room. For the crime of murder in the first degree, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, no leniency, no rehabilitation, no day of release. The heaviest penalty possible, a punishment fitting 30 years of lies, grief and manipulation of an entire community's trust. The trial was broadcast live on 3 major Tennessee networks. The words "life without parole" flashed across screens and sent shockwaves through the public. Headlines ran: "Pastor sentenced to life for 1992 murder, justice after 3 decades. Memphis shattered by final verdict." Many watching from the church Cole once led wept. Some still believed him innocent. Some admitted they felt betrayed. Others fell silent, the silence of people who had grown up with this wound. That day Memphis wasn't divided by politics or religion. Memphis was divided by truth. A truth that brought justice, but also demolished the image of a man an entire community had leaned on. Michael stood when the sentence was read. He didn't cheer, didn't cry out loud, didn't hug anyone fiercely. He simply stood, hand over his heart, as if to keep it from falling. Elena's mother, hair almost completely gray, face lined with decades, let silent tears fall. She whispered, "At last, she's been heard." Everly walked over and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "We did what we promised," he said. Michael nodded, a small nod, but carrying the weight of 30 years of loss. The judge asked, "Mr. Cole, do you wish to make a statement before leaving the court?" Cole rose slowly, looked at the Ward family for the first time in the entire trial. "I'm sorry," he said, voice raw, "but I know this apology doesn't bring Elena back. I wasn't alone, but I'm guilty enough to be here." In the courtroom, no one responded. That apology fell like a pebble sinking to the bottom of a lake. No ripple, no power to move anyone. Some sins are beyond redemption by words. As Cole was led away, the crowd outside shouted in a chaotic mix of emotions, "Justice for Elena. How could you do this? Lock him away forever." But amid the chaos remained the most haunting question. D.A. Hale, left in her closing, Cole was not alone. The second DNA remains unidentified. The Elena Ward case is closed, but the door to investigating others is now open. The verdict was signed. The sentence entered into the state system. Cole was taken to the prison transport van, but Memphis knew, though justice for Elena had arrived, the remaining truth, the truth about the second man, was still waiting to be named, and that would be the final chapter of the longest investigative journey in the city's history. After the verdict, Memphis did not return to normal. For 3 decades the city had lived with the obsession of a girl vanishing into darkness, and the possibility that a killer walked among them disguised as a kindly pastor. When the truth came out, the community went through a form of collective grief, relief at finally knowing who killed Elena, mixed with the harder question, how did we not see it for 30 years? 1 week after sentencing, the church where Cole once preached reopened, not to pray for him, but to hold an unprecedented memorial service for Elena Ward. The service was led not by a pastor, but by a group of parishioners, who decided the church owed Elena an honor she had never received. The ceremony lasted over 3 hours, and drew more than 400 people, not just those who had known Elena, but many who had never met her yet, had grown up sharing her disappearance story. Some brought flowers, some brought journals, some placed letters on the pulpit. "Elena, we never forgot you." In the flickering candlelight, an elderly woman stood and said, We trusted one man too much, and trusted too little, the things Elena tried to leave behind in the dark. No one argued. No one defended. The entire community quietly admitted they had been deceived by Cole's image, and that deception had silenced Elena for 3 decades. The service ended with soft piano music, but its echo lasted far longer, a reminder that justice, even when late, can heal, but it cannot give back time. 2 months later, the mayor of Memphis announced the creation of the Elena Ward Foundation for Missing Women, a scholarship and support fund for women at risk of disappearance or domestic violence. The foundation's goals: mentorships for high school girls pursuing criminal justice, criminology, or sociology, financial aid for families of missing persons, funding for risk awareness training programs, resources for anti-trafficking and anti-violence initiatives. A small ceremony was held at City Hall. Michael Ward, in a black suit, spoke. "My sister never got to write her own future, but through this foundation, hundreds of other young women will get to write theirs." In that moment, Memphis set aside the pain and made Elena not just a victim, but the starting point for change. After the trial, Michael did something no one expected. He applied to the MPD investigator training program. He said he wasn't seeking revenge. He wanted to continue the story Elena's case had written into his life. 3 years later, Michael officially became an investigator in the Memphis Cold Case Unit. The first file he reopened wasn't Elena's, hers was closed, but the file of a woman missing since 1999, still unsolved. Colleagues say that whenever Michael enters the records room, he always places a hand on his sister's file before starting work. Not to remember the pain, but to remember why he is there. Everly, now nearing the end of his career, said, "No one understands the silence of a cold case like someone who lived inside it for 30 years. Michael became the bridge between past and present, between Elena and the nameless victims, still waiting. Before this case, Memphis was a city that believed in shallow safety, that evil came from strangers, that crime always showed clear signs. But the Elena Ward case shattered those illusions. Now the city understands. Monsters can wear the face of goodness. Justice doesn't come quickly, but it comes with persistence. Communities must stare into the darkness, instead of looking away. Truth can be buried, but it never disappears." A local reporter wrote, "Memphis is no longer as naive as it once was. But in that awakening, we have found new strength. For 30 years Elena lay nameless in Shelby Forest. For 30 years her car sat silent, telling a story no one heard. For 30 years her family lived torn between hope and despair. But now her name is on scholarships, on court records, on the lips of an entire city, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a symbol of a fight that refused to surrender to time." In the end, Memphis learned one thing: justice doesn't come quickly, but it comes. And when it does, no one in the community ever sees the world again with the innocent eyes of 30 years earlier. Elena Ward's legacy is not pain, it is awakening. A reminder that every darkness leaves traces, and every truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way back to the light. Looking back at the Elena Ward story in today's America, what haunts most is not just the crime, but how an entire community had to relearn the meaning of safety and trust. Elena didn't vanish on some remote mountain road. She disappeared in the heart of Memphis, after a late shift at a bar, in a busy, familiar city. She vanished just steps from the back door, reminding us that in modern America, especially for women, walking home alone with the thought, "I'll be fine," always carries risk. The detail that Pastor Raymond Cole, the man the community trusted completely, was the one whose DNA was in Elena's car, is a slap to the naive belief that good people look good. In a country where religious and charitable figures are often pillars, the lesson isn't to suspect everyone. It's this: never let a person's social halo blind logical thinking. If something feels off, trust intuition, trust data, trust the small details, just like the trash DNA from a coffee cup finally told the truth. The fact the case was solved through genetic genealogy, soil analysis, timeline modeling, and vehicle route reconstruction teaches another lesson: science and persistence are justice's greatest allies. America today faces tens of thousands of missing persons and cold cases, Elena's story reminds us that investing in forensics, data preservation, and case re-examination isn't a luxury, it's a moral duty to victims. Finally, Michael becoming a cold case investigator, and the Elena Ward Foundation for Missing Women, is a message to every American: we can turn loss into action. None of us could save Elena, but we can protect others, by speaking up, supporting victims, believing in science, and never letting a disappearance be treated as just a thing of the past. If you want to keep following journeys to reclaim justice like Elena Ward's, please remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, where we continue shining light on truths once hidden by darkness.